Hi guys. So we're back with The Great Gatsby, about to start chapter 2, which starts on page 23. Just as a quick recap, we just finished chapter 1. We were introduced to our key primary characters. We met Nick, who is our narrator. He's here visiting for the summer. We met Daisy, his cousin, and Tom, her husband. Those are 3 out of our 4 main characters. We learned that Tom and Daisy are not in the happiest of marriages. Daisy's pretty miserable. You know, we had that quote where she says she's glad her daughter, she wishes her daughter was a beautiful little fool. That's the best thing a girl can be. We find out rumors that Tom has a mistress who we're going to meet in chapter 2. We learn that where Nick is living, there's East Egg and West Egg. One is more fashionable, old money. One is less fashionable, it's the new money. That's where Nick lives. But his cousins, who have a lot of money and live in this exorbitant mansion, live on the other side. So we're about to start chapter 2, but before we do, just remember you're keeping an eye on those themes. So the big thing we want to pay attention to is that materialistic culture and whether or not it's really making these people happy. Keep an eye out for this idea of dreams and like the things that we hope and want to achieve, whether or not people are all good or all bad, and the idea of the past kind of recircling in the present. Remember, you also want to keep an eye out for motifs. We haven't had our lesson yet about motifs, so you'll learn what those are. But a big clue is anytime these motifs are mentioned, you're going to be seeing a scene that relates to one of our key themes. So big things to pay attention for are geography, how the different locations are described. Are we in East Egg or in West Egg, or are we in the valley, which we're going to meet in chapter 2. Colors. Yellow, green, the green light is a big one. Cars and parties. Okay, any scene that involves a party is going to be important to our themes. And we're going to have a party in chapter 2. Just kidding. Well, not really. Okay, so chapter 2 takes place, again, Nick is our narrator. And we're going to be introduced to a couple key things in this chapter. So before we get started, they're going to describe the Valley of Ashes, and it's kind of this gap in between East and West Egg where Nick and Gatsby and Tom and Daisy live. Then there's the Valley of Ashes, and then there's New York City over here. And so the Valley of Ashes is this like really slummy kind of grungy area, and that Myrtle, Tom's mistress, and her husband live in. And so Tom has to drive through the Valley of Ashes to get to New York City. So they're going to describe the Valley of Ashes. We're going to meet Myrtle and her husband. Tom's going to pick her up, take her into New York City so they can all have their affair in the city. And Nick gets invited, so he's going to go to this party, and he's just going to see this culture that's swirling around. Remember, Nick is Daisy's cousin, and he's being invited to a party by Tom where he's bringing his mistress. So yeah, we'll see how Fitzgerald feels about that. Okay, summary over. Chapter 2. About halfway between West Egg and New York, the motor road hastily joins the railroad and runs beside it for 1/4 of a mile, so as to shrink away from a certain desolate area of land. This is the Valley of Ashes. A fantastic farm where ashes grow like wheat into ridges and hills and grotesque gardens. Where ashes take the forms of houses and chimneys and rising smoke, and finally, with a transcendent effort, of men who move dimly and already crumbling through the powdery air. Occasionally a line of gray cars crawls through an invisible track, gives out a ghastly creak, and comes to rest. And immediately the ash-gray men swarm up with leaden spades and stir up an impenetrable cloud, which screens their obscure operations from your sight. But above the gray land and the spasms of bleak dust which drift endlessly over it, you perceive after a moment the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. The eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg are blue and gigantic. Their retinas are 1 yard high. They look out of no face, but instead from a pair of enormous yellow spectacles, which pass over non-existent nose. Evidently some wild wag of an oculist set them there to fatten his practice in the borough of Queens, and then sank himself down into an eternal blindness, or forgot them, and moved away. But his eyes, dimmed a little by the many paintless days under sun and rain, brood on over the solemn dumping ground. Side note, those spectacles are on a billboard. So picture a giant billboard that's got two big eyes behind a set of glasses. That's what they're describing, is this peeling billboard. And we had all of that description of this gray, hopeless valley. Even the people are gray and made from ashes. Just that sense of loss and hopelessness is how this chapter starts. 24. The Valley of Ashes is bounded on one side by a small, foul river, and when the drawbridge is let up to let barges pass through, the passengers on waiting trains can stare at the dismal scene for as long as half an hour. There is always a halt there of at least a minute, and it was because of this that I first met Tom Buchanan's mistress. The fact that he had won was insisted upon wherever he was known. His acquaintances resented the fact that he turned up in popular restaurants with her, and leaving her at a table, sauntered about, chatting with whomever he knew. Though I was curious to see her, I had no desire to meet her. But I did. I went up to New York with Tom on the train one afternoon, and when we stopped by the ash heaps, he jumped to his feet, and taking hold of my elbow, literally forced me from the car. "We're getting off," he insisted. "I want you to meet my girl." I think he'd tanked up a good deal at luncheon, and his determination to have my company bordered on violence. The supercilious assumption was that on Sunday afternoon I had nothing better to do. I followed him over a low, whitewashed railroad fence, and we walked back 100 yards along the road under Dr. Eckelberg's persistent stare. The only building in sight was a small block of yellow brick sitting on the edge of the wasteland, a sort of compact Main Street ministering to it and contiguous to absolutely nothing. One of the 3 shops it contained was for rent, and another was an all-night restaurant, approached by a trail of ashes. The third was a garage. Repairs. George B. Wilson. Cars bought and sold. And I followed Tom inside. The interior was unprosperous and bare. The only car visible was the dust-covered wreck of a Ford which crouched in a dim corner. It had occurred to me that this shadow of a garage must be a blind, and that sumptuous and romantic apartments were concealed overhead, when the proprietor himself appeared in the door of an office, wiping his hands on a piece of waste. He was a blond, spiritless man, anemic and faintly handsome. When he saw us, a damp gleam of hope sprang into his light blue eyes. "Hello, Wilson, old man," said Tom, slapping him jovially on the shoulder. "How's business?" "I can't complain," answered Wilson unconvincingly. "When you going to sell me that car?" "Next week. I've got my man working on it now. Works pretty slow, don't he?" "No, he don't," said Tom coldly. "And if you feel that way about it, maybe I'd better sell it somewhere else after all." I did not mean that," explained Wilson quickly. "I just meant—" But his voice faded off, and Tom glanced impatiently around the garage. Then I heard footsteps on the stairs, and in a moment the thickish figure of a woman blocked out the light from the office door. She was in the middle 30s and faintly stout, but she carried her surplus flesh sensuously as some woman can. Her face, above a spotted dress of dark blue crêpe de chine, contained no facet or gleam of beauty. But there was an immediately perceptible vitality about her, as if the nerves of her body were continually smoldering. She smiled slowly, and walking through her husband as if he were a ghost, shook hands with Tom, looking him flush in the eye. Then she wet her lips, and without turning around, spoke to her husband in a soft, coarse voice. "Get some chairs, why don't you, so somebody can sit down?" "Oh, sure," agreed Tom hurriedly, and went toward the little office, mingling immediately with the cement color of the walls. A white ashen dust veiled his dark suit and his pale hair as it veiled everything in the vicinity, except his wife, who moved close to Tom. "I want to see you," said Tom intently. "Get on the next train." "All right." "I'll meet you by the newsstand on the lower level." She nodded and moved away from him just as George Wilson emerged with 2 chairs from his office door. We waited for her down the road and out of sight. It was a few days before the 4th of July, and a gray, scrawny Italian child was setting torpedoes in a row along the railroad track. "Terrible place, isn't it?" said Tom, exchanging a frown with Dr. Eckelberg. "Awful. Does her good to get away." "Doesn't her husband object?" "Wilson? He thinks she goes to see her sister in New York. He's so dumb he doesn't even know he's alive." So Tom Buchanan and his girl and I went together to New York. Or not quite together, for Mrs. Wilson sat discreetly in another car. Tom deferred that much to the sensibilities of those East-Eggers who might be on the train. She had changed her dress to a brown-figured muslin, which stretched tight over her rather wide hips as Tom helped her to the platform in New York. At the newsstand, she bought a copy of the Town Tattle and a moving picture magazine, and in the station drugstore some cold cream and a small flask of perfume. Upstairs, in the solemn echoing drive, she let 4 taxicabs drive away before she selected a new one, lavender-colored, with gray upholstery, and in this we slid out from the mass of the station into the glowing sunshine. But immediately she turned sharply from the window and, leaning forward, tapped on the front glass. "I want to get one of those dogs," she said earnestly. "I want to get one for the apartment. They're nice to have a dog." We backed up to a gray old man who bore an absurd resemblance to John D. Rockefeller. In a basket swung from his neck cowered a dozen very recent puppies of an indeterminate breed. "What kind are they?" asked Mrs. Wilson eagerly as he came to the taxi window. "All kinds. What kind do you want, lady?" "I'd like to get one of those police dogs. I don't suppose you've got that kind." The man peered doubtfully into the basket, plunged his hand, and drew up one wriggling by the back of its neck. "That's no police dog," said Tom. "No, it's not exactly a police dog," said the man with disappointment in his voice. "It's more of an Airedale." He passed his hand over the brown wash rag of a back. "Look at that coat. Some coat. That's a dog that'll never bother you with catching cold." "I think it's cute," said Mrs. Wilson enthusiastically. "How much is it?" "That dog?" He looked at it admiringly. "That dog will cost you $10. The Airedale, undoubtedly there was an Airedale concerned in it somewhere, though its feet were startlingly white, changed hands and settled down into Mrs. Wilson's lap, where she fondled the weatherproof coat with rapture. "Is it a boy or a girl?" she asked delicately. That dog's a boy." "It's a bitch," said Tom decisively. "Here's your money. Go and buy 10 more dogs with it." We drove over to Fifth Avenue, so warm and soft, almost pastoral, on the summer Sunday afternoon that I wouldn't have been surprised to see a great flock of white sheep turn the corner. "Hold on," I said. "I have to leave you here." "No, you don't," interposed Tom quickly. "Myrtle'll be hurt if you don't come up to the apartment. Won't you, Myrtle?" "Come on," she urged. "I'll telephone my sister Catherine. She's said to be very beautiful by people who ought to know." "Well, I'd like to, but—" We went on, cutting back again over the park toward the West Hundreds. At 158th Street, the cab stopped at a slice on a long white cake of apartment houses. Throwing a regal homecoming glance around the neighborhood, Mrs. Wilson gathered up her dog and her other purchases and went haughtily in. "I'm going to have the McKees come up," she announced as we rose in the elevator. "And of course I got to call up my sister, too." The apartment was on the top floor. A small living room, a small dining room, a small bedroom, and a bath. The living room was crowded to the doors with a set of tapestried furniture entirely too large for it. so that to move about was to stumble continually over scenes of ladies swinging in the garden of Versailles. The only picture was an over-enlarged photograph, apparently a hen singing on a blurred rock. Looking at it from a distance, however, the hen resolved itself into a bonnet, and the countenance of a stout old lady beamed down into the room. Several old copies of Town Tattle lay on the table together, with a copy of Simon Called Peter, and some of the small scandal magazines of Broadway. Mrs. Wilson was first concerned with the dog. A reluctant elevator boy went for a box full of straw and some milk, to which he added on his own initiative a tin of large, hard dog biscuits, one of which decomposed apathetically in the saucer of milk all afternoon. Meanwhile, Tom brought out a bottle of whiskey from a locked bureau door. I've been drunk just twice in my life, and the second time was that afternoon. So everything that happened has a dim, hazy cast over it, although after 8 o'clock the apartment was full of cheerful sun. Sitting on Tom's lap, Mrs. Wilson called up several people on the telephone. Then there were no cigarettes, and I went out to buy some at the drugstore on the counter. When I came back, they had disappeared, so I sat down discreetly in the living room and read a chapter of Simon Called Peter. Either it was terrible stuff or the whiskey distorted things, because it didn't make any sense to me. Just as Tom and Myrtle, after the first drink, Mrs. Wilson and I called each other by our first names, reappeared, completely commenced to arrive at the apartment door. The sister, Catherine, was a slender, worldly girl of about 30, with a solid, sticky bob of red hair, and a complexion powdered milky white. Her eyebrows had been plucked and then drawn on again in a more rakish angle, but the efforts of nature toward the restoration of the old alignment gave a blurred air to her face. When she moved about, there was an incessant clicking of an innumerable pottery bracelets, jangled up and down upon her arms. She came in with such proprietary haste and looked around so possessively at the furniture that I'd wondered if she lived here. But when I asked her, she laughed immoderately, repeated my question aloud, and told me she lived with a girlfriend at a hotel. Mr. McKee was a pale, feminine man from the flat below. He had just shaved, for there was a white spot of lather on his cheekbone, and he was most respectful in his greeting to everyone in the room. He informed me that he was in the artistic game, and I gathered later that he was a photographer and had made the dim enlargement of Mrs. Wilson's mother, which hovered like an ectoplasm on the wall. His wife was shrill, languid, handsome, and horrible. She told me with pride that her husband had photographed her 127 times since they had been married. Mrs. Wilson had changed her costume some time before and was now attired in an elaborate afternoon dress of cream-colored chiffon, which gave out a continual rustle as she swept about the room. With the influence of the dress, her personality had also undergone a change. The intense vitality that had been so remarkable in the garage was converted into an impressive hauteur. Her laughter, her gesture, her assertions became more violently affected moment by moment, and as she expanded, the room grew smaller around her, until she seemed to be revolving in a noisy, creaking pivot through the smoky air. "My dear," she told her sister in a high, menacing shout, "most of these fellows will cheat you every time. All they think of is money. I had a woman up here last week to look at my feet. When she gave me the bill, you'd have thought she had my appendicitis cut out." What was the name of the woman?" asked Mrs. McKee. "Mrs. Eberhard. She goes around looking at people's feet in their own homes." "I like your dress," remarked Mrs. McKee. "I think it's adorable." Mrs. Wilson rejected the compliment by raising her eyebrow in disdain. "Ah, it's just a crazy old thing," she said. "I just slip it on sometimes when I don't care what I look like." "But it looks wonderful on you, if you know what I mean," pursued Mrs. McKee. "If Chester could only get you in that pose, I think he could make something of it." We all looked in silence at Mrs. Wilson, who removed a strand of hair from over her eyes and looked back at us with a brilliant smile. Mr. McKee regarded her intently with his head on one side, and then moved his head back and forth slowly in front of his face. I should change the light, he said after a moment. I'd like to bring out the modeling of the features, and I'll try to get a hold of all that back hair. I wouldn't think of changing the light, cried Mrs. McKee. I think it's, her husband said, shh, and we were all looked at the subject again, whereupon Tom Buchanan yawned audibly and got to his feet. You McKees have something to drink, he said. Get some more ice and mineral water, Myrtle, before everyone goes to sleep. I told that boy about the ice. Myrtle raised her eyebrows in despair at the shiftlessness of the lower orders. These people, you have to keep after them all the time. She looked at me and laughed pointlessly. Then she flounced over to the dog, kissed it with ecstasy, and swept into the kitchen, implying that a dozen chefs awaited her orders there. I've done some nice things out on Long Island, asserted Mr. McKee. Tom looked at him blankly. 2 of them we have framed downstairs. 2 what? Demanded Tom. 2 studies. One of them I call Montanook Point, the gulls. The other I call Montanook Point, the sea. The sister Catherine sat down beside me on the couch. Do you live on Long Island too? She inquired. I live at West Egg. Really? I was down there at a party about a month ago at a man named Gatsby's. Do you know him? I live next door to him. Well, they say he's a nephew or a cousin of Kaiser Wilhelm's. That's where all his money comes from. Really? She nodded. I'm scared of him. I'd hate to have him get anything on me. This absorbing information about my neighbor was interrupted by Mrs. McKee pointing suddenly at Catherine. Chester, I think you could do something with her. She broke out, but Mr. McKee only nodded in a bored way and turned his attention to Tom. I'd like to do more work on Long Island, if I could get the entry. All I ask is that they should give me a start. Ask Myrtle, said Tom, breaking into a short shout of laughter as Mrs. Wilson entered with a tray. She'll give you a letter of introduction, won't you, Myrtle? Do what? She asked, startled. You'll give Mr. McKee a letter of introduction to your husband so he can do some studies of him. His lips moved silently for a moment as he invented. George B. Wilson at the gasoline pump, or something like that. Catherine leaned close to me and whispered in my ear. Neither of them can stand the person they're married to. Can't they? Can't stand them. She looked at Myrtle and then at Tom. What I say is, why go on living with them if they can't stand them? If I was them, I'd get a divorce and get married to each other right away. Doesn't she like Wilson either? The answer to this was unexpected. It came from Myrtle, who had overheard the question, and it was violent and obscene. You see, cried Catherine triumphantly. She lowered her voice again. It's really his wife that's keeping them apart. She's a Catholic, and they don't believe in divorce. Daisy was not a Catholic, and I was a little shocked at the elaborateness of the lie. When they do get married, continued Catherine, they're going west to live for a while until it blows over. It'd be more discreet to go to Europe. Oh, do you like Europe? She exclaimed surprisingly. I just got back from Monte Carlo. Really? Just last year I went over there with another girl. Stay long? No, we just went to Monte Carlo and came back. We went by way of Marseille. We had over $1,200 when we started, but we got gypped out of all of it in 2 days in the private rooms. We had an awful time getting back, I can tell you. God, how I hated that town. The late afternoon sky bloomed in the window for a moment like the blue honey of the Mediterranean. Then the shrill voice of Mrs. McKee called me back into the room. I almost made a mistake, too, she declared vigorously. I almost married a little kike who's been after me for years. I knew he was below me. Everybody kept saying to me, Lucille, that man's way below you. But if I hadn't met Chester, he'd have gotten me for sure. Yeah, but listen, said Myrtle Wilson, nodding her head up and down. At least you didn't marry him. I know I didn't. Well, I married him, said Myrtle unambiguously, and that's the difference between your case and mine. Why did you, Myrtle? Demanded Catherine. Nobody forced you to. Myrtle considered. I married him because I thought he was a gentleman, she said finally. I thought he knew something about breeding, but he wasn't fit to lick my shoe. All right, we're going to pause there in the middle of the party. Just a quick recap. We met Myrtle and her husband. Myrtle is Tom's mistress. We saw how Tom interacts with Myrtle's husband. It's almost like he enjoys manipulating him. He has him on the ropes. He knows that he's really, really poor and he's desperate to buy this car because he's hoping to make some money. And then Tom's just kind of like dangling in front of him like a little treat that he'll never have. Meanwhile, he's taking his wife, brings her to New York. They're having this really obnoxious party, and Nick is there kind of watching everything and interacting. And the most important thing is we saw the Valley of Ashes, which is that miserable location in between East and West Egg and New York City. And notice how the language and the description changed there. The Valley of Ashes was described as dark and dreary and depressing. All the people were described using similes and metaphors that were super, super sad, like ashes and just grayness and shuffling and loss of life, versus New York. Now it's pastoral, it's beautiful, it's peaceful, it's colorful. So just pay attention to that shift. We only have actually a few more pages left of chapter 2, so I'll check in with you in a moment.